regulation 95 grains. In this case, Swiss number 3, which is roughly 2F. I'd say he's dead, Jim.
All right then.
Following on from a most successful part 1 of A Tale of Two Bakers, the chap and I sat down to discuss our results and other aspects of Baker rifle ownership. So stand by. Here we are with some long format British muzzleloaders.
Well, Fab, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a bit of a long time coming in getting this project put together, but finally, we've given the viewers a tale of two bakers.
Yes, I hope they enjoy what was probably going to be an hour or so of rambling between two nerds.
So we've, at this point in time, we've sort of both had an opportunity to do the practices we agreed on as far as that comparison. We've both shot a sort of 10-round grouping and a 3-round rapid using, well, in this case, the Master Own cartridge, which we'll get into a little bit later. I thought, though, that the viewers might be interested in maybe a bit of a backstory because Baker rifles, as you're well aware, are fairly rare out there, not only originals, but also in reproduction forms, especially in actual firing rifled versions of the Baker rifle. So perhaps that I might ask you a couple of questions because I'm interested as well, is how, you came to know and admire might be the right word, the Baker rifle.
Exactly. Admire is a very good word because I would say fell in love with it due to Sharp's rifles. So any kids of my generation watching in the 90s, watching Sharp's rifles and then progressing on to the novels will have been very familiar with the rifle. It was always a running joke at school, due to my heritage, of course, that I should not appreciate the Sharp's rifle series. But no, the rifle itself, it's a beautiful piece of kit. I was very intrigued as to what the actual performance was. I read the 95th Rifles book as well, which has plenty of, well, not plenty, but has some nice anecdotes of field performance in battle and so on. And that was sort of on the back burner until I sort of finished uni and all that, and then came to seeing what was out there in terms of getting one myself. Adamant that it should be as close to the original as possible. Now the originals are out there, as you say, but they're incredibly expensive. I'm sure they are perfectly functional, but due to their rarity and price, it's probably best to leave them on display or in museums. I don't know how I stumbled across the Peter Dyson and Son, who are British gunsmiths, still in existence. And on their website at the time, they offered a 100% reproduction Baker rifle, which would be, so it'd be a custom order. They only made them on request. And so yeah, I ummed and ahed for a month or so and then put my name down. And a year later, I picked it up at a gun fair in Belgium. So I'd already moved out to the UK by then. And yes, and this was staring at me from across the the market hall of the gun show. And Mr. Dyson himself said, "Yeah, there you go, that's yours."
I can imagine the moment, the heart racing and the after waiting so long for it and being something that is had grown as a interest and that kind of thing over a long period of time, finally being able to put your hands on something that now you own in that sense would be quite the moment.
You could go at the time, well, it's probably it hasn't changed, to be honest. Perdozzoli was the big producer of reproduction firearms, and there's just a big gap. There's all the muskets, smoothbore muskets you could possibly want. And then it's jumps up to the rifled muskets, percussion rifled muskets, but there's this gap. Of course, the Baker rifle is a niche one, so especially at the time, it's understandable that they didn't have that. They had the generic Jaeger, which they still produce, but for a history buff, it's not enough.
Sure. I know I understand, though I haven't had firsthand knowledge of it in terms of discussions or information, though I understand they are making moves to produce a Baker, which will, I'm sure, fill a huge niche in the community, both the shooting and I guess reenacting as well, who primarily rely on like smoothbore versions, but an actual firing intended to be fired rifled Baker is something that is obviously the market is completely devoid of. Well, I shouldn't say completely because we both own them, but in terms of like for the masses, and easily accessible, with a reasonable little commercially manufactured, I guess is the best way to put it. And if they do decide to do that, then that will certainly bring the Baker into more hands of shooters in particular. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean this is a particular. I mean, it took a year to build, and they kept at the time they took pictures, uploaded them, and sent them by email. So I asked that specifically when I ordered it if they wouldn't mind sending me updates, which they gladly did. So I would get I could see it coming into being.
Sure.
Which was great. So I know it wasn't just put together off the shelf; it was really made. And then they would say, "Oh, sorry, we've got to wait for the castings for these pieces," and so on. So it's really a traditional gunsmith.
Right. Now, did he make all the parts himself?
I think that so some of the parts, it seemed that, for example, castings they outsourced to another company. But certainly all the wood, lockwork, the barrel, that was all in house. This is about 20 years ago, so I suspect it's more the and sons that are doing the work now than Peter himself. Although when we were discussing this project, I think it was before lockdown, I think.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've actually phoned them up because the Baker had disappeared from their website.
Really?
And so I wanted to make sure they were actually talking about something that still existed. And they said, no. In fact, they were submerged with orders. So they had taken it off to calm the interest, the impulse buyers, and so on. So they'd have time to clear the backlog. So obviously the interest is still there, and if as you say, there's moves towards a more mass-produced version, then obviously it's still high.
I can certainly appreciate the amount of time something like that can take. Of course, viewers of the channel will be well aware that I made my Baker from rifle shop parts, and it took some months to put together, especially coming from a point of view of never having done that kind of thing before, and having just sort of basic hand tools and whatnot, and just having to be very methodical and careful in terms of not trying to take on too much at a time or too much in a given sitting, so that your mind didn't get tired and you make some mistakes of removing material, either wood or metal, that you'll nenever be able to put back, right?
I'm becoming more and more conscious of this. If it's going too well, just stop.
That's sage advice.
Carry on tomorrow. Yeah.
Probably the hardest part of the build that I did was cutting the keyways for the barrel keys in through the wood and lining all that up. And I since built the rifle, I've come by a couple of different techniques in order to achieve that in a much more calm and certain way, because the way I had ended up doing it was very man and shed kind of stuff. I mean, like using levels and eyeballing and just a bit of faith involved in when I plunge the drill press down and whatnot. But since then, I've come up with a couple of different methods that will, should I build something next, we'll be able to achieve those things without so much stress.
Yeah, I'm still hesitant to get a rifle shop kit. But,
yeah, it certainly isn't. I know when people think of, when you say kit, you have the connotation. Well, in my mind, when I hear kit, it's just a bunch of parts that you need to assemble. But that's certainly not the case with the rifle shop build, in that it's more of a part set.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so all the metal comes rough cast with the sprue to a degree still attached. So you've got a, on whatever, like the butt plate's got the sprue, extensions. The main part where the pour happened has been cut off, but there's still big globs of metal everywhere that you've got to cut off and then grind off and polish down, so you can't see where they were anymore. So it's certainly a more involved than a simple assembly of the parts, right? But in that sense, it's a fun project. The parts that the rifle shop gives in their sets are very high quality in terms of fit in particular. So that the inletting that is done on the stock and the metal parts, there's very little difference between the dimensions of them. So you've got to be careful in terms of being really aggressive on finishing of edges and this kind of thing, because if you do, you'll end up with a big gap.
Yeah.
And you'll never be able to replace either the wood or the metal. So it's just something you had to be really, really careful about.
Which I can't remember what the barrel also come from there.
The barrel did come from me. They contracted out to Coleraine. And that barrel deviates somewhat from the ordnance pattern.
Right.
For me, it was more, well, I shouldn't say more, but it was certainly along the similar lines to yourself. There was a certain, not fascination, but certain interest in Sharp and Bernard Cornwell's novels at the time. That's how I sort of came by it, that he was writing those first few books in the early 80s. Maybe. And it was introduced to me in about the third book, I believe. And so I immediately read that and then went back and read the other 2 or 3 that were in existence at the time, and then carried on for the bulk of the series, especially as it went along through the peninsula. By the time that Cornwell got to sort of Waterloo and then all the other ancillary books that he was writing about Sharp, I was sort of maybe moving on at that point. But certainly that interest in the Baker and how the rifles fit into the greater military context was something that I always sort of had an interest in. And sort of like you, one day it was, hey, wait a minute, what's the opportunity here? And I actually got my first Baker was actually an Indian reproduction with a proper rifle barrel put on it, and enjoyed that for quite a few years. And then I decided that I was looking for something with a little bit better in terms of quality, and I decided that the rifle shop was the way to go. So looking back, it's certainly the right decision. I'm very happy with the way things turned out. As much fun and enjoyment as I had out of the Indian one, the lock wasn't perhaps the best put together, and the trigger was very mushy and whatnot. But the barrel was of modern manufacturer, a very high quality barrel with a vent liner in it, as a matter of fact. So and it shot relatively well. That particular Baker had a sort of like an ordnance pattern barrel to it, in the sense of a 7-groove 1 and 120 twist. And so it was pretty much exactly what would have been expected of an ordnance Baker, as far as the pattern of rifling goes anyway. Which leads me to sort of to the next sort of maybe question or topic we can discuss, which is some of the particulars of each of our rifles. I suspect that coming from 2 different manufacturers, they've got a little bit of differences between them. And maybe you'd like to just sort of give us a sort of a once over about some of the features of your rifle.
My one, as far as I can tell, is strictly 1805 pattern. So it has the cut in the stock here to account for swelling, or rather the swelling of the stock against the ramrod, which will then crack this part. The lock is 1805 onwards pattern, and they've done. I mean, apart from the fact that they're fresh, the markings are really absolutely spot on to the period with the proof stamps.
Oh yes.
Etc. I mean, obviously they haven't cheated. They've put clearly on the barrel. They've put their name on there, so you can't palm this off as a reproduction. But the modern London proof house proofs are underneath, so they're hidden away, which is very considerate of them. The Ramrod tip, I think I sent you a picture. This is my reworked version, which is then not quite flat, slightly arched on the top. We won't see it on the vid, and then the through hole. The pic I sent you was the original head, which has sort of a mushroom, sort of bigger cylindrical rounded tip. That was probably the only really striking difference between that and well, in the DeWitt Bailey's book, which has all the different breakdown of the rifles. The only thing I explicitly asked them to do was to sight in the barrel for 50 and 100.
So your sights are obviously done that way to 50 and 100 then.
Because that was the ranges I was going to shoot.
Right. Now, what does that make the front sight in terms of dimension wise?
Well, I don't know what the original was, but it doesn't look. I don't know how it compares to yours.
Right.
Whether it's prouder or not. But certainly they did their work, because it really is spot on.
The in DeWitt Bailey's book, the front sights are they're surprisingly low. That I guess ordnance makers were cited to 200 and 300 is my understanding, right. And which would then make sense that the low front sight would give an increased NPI. So having a 200-yard setting on the lowest setting with a low front sight, that sort of all makes sense to me, because your back sight and my back sight look fairly similar in terms of height, but I think my front sight is a little bit well, I'm not quite sure, but it certainly is higher than what the pictures in DeWitt Bailey's book show.
Yeah.
And because mine's cited for 1 and 200, then that would make sense, obviously. So
yeah, because I ordered it while I was living in Netherlands at the time. 50 meters was the maximum I was ever going to do. So do that for the fixed rear sight, and maybe I get the chance to fire at 100, so make the leaf sight at 100.
Right. And it's got the rounded patch box, being an 1805 pattern.
There we go.
Oh yeah, yep. There we are. Yeah, with the single compartment, yeah. And of course, it's got the G crest, right, which is ubiquitous to all bakers.
Yeah. Apart from that,
well, ordnance ones anyway.
Say bayonet lock. It's also
right. Now your barrel is it a 7 groove 1 and 120?
Yes, the barrel is strictly. I'll try and at some point take a picture of it, but you can kind of see the rifling. But it is as it should be, 7 groove, 1 in 120, 0.625 inch.
Right.
Diameter. So yeah, that was strictly as it should be. It's surprisingly thick. I keep every time you sort of look down the muzzle, how thick the ball is.
I don't know if you can see the same here.
Yeah, so
but it's similar in terms of the barrel wall thickness, especially when you compare it to sort of historical examples. There's a lot of safety in there.
Oh yeah, right.
That's the sort of one thing that mine deviates slightly. We're offering, I guess, based on, and I did talk to the rifle shop about it, but they based their sort of stock offering, as it were, on a volunteer example that they had examined. And that had a different style of rifling in it, in the sense that the grooves were round bottomed,
Mhm.
and there was only 6 of them.
Yeah.
And there was a different twist. I believe it was 1 in 60 or something along those lines. So about twice as fast as an ordnance baker. And so I asked them about it when it went time to sort of inquire about, because of course the Indian baker with the rebarrel barrel that I had on it was ordnance pattern of 7 groove 1 in 120. I was sort of aiming for that. And when I discovered that they didn't offer that, I was kind of not upset, but certainly, well, maybe that deserves a few more questions. And what I was able to arrive at was a bit of a compromise, that the style of rifling that the company provided, the round bottomed, which was it's better for fouling management and that kind of thing, and both historically and to this day as well. But I was able to modify the twist to a 1 in 120. So
Okay. So
given the fact that it's different type of groove, different type of rifling, the ball is still spinning when it leaves the muzzle at the appropriate twist rate. So to me, that was an acceptable, without going too down far the rabbit hole as far as trying to modify manufacturing, that they were offering. They were able to accommodate that. So that's what I decided to go with. And I've been very happy. And although it's not that 7 groove, square bottomed rifling that the ordnance pattern baker had and my old one had, it certainly is something that I'm more than happy with. It shoots and can fire it as long as things don't dry out in any kind of intervals for too long, then it shoots just fine and loads wonderfully and whatnot. You mentioned that your barrel is 0.625, and then what size ball do you use out of it?
I use a 0.600 ball.
Okay.
With a 0.025 patch.
Right. So our patches sound fairly similar in terms of thickness. Mine's about a 2.2.
It's it's a good combination. I can load, so the 10 rounds, for example, that was absolutely fine. No cleaning. It loads really well. I experimented when I initially got it. I had some thicker. I went up to 0.45. Then it just got silly. You had to literally hammer the thing down. Whereas this, we can use the loading technique, which I learned from you. Before, I'd been using a separate rod. I never was using the rod on the gun. Then, maybe I can give it a shot. And now I just use that. So I just use the other one for cleaning.
Right.
With that combination, I use the short starter when doing patch ball still, just to save my hand.
Yeah.
But otherwise, as yours all day, works fine.
Yeah. You said that you mentioned you've obviously had your rifle delivered, and you've got it in hand now. Now it's in terms of sort of finding out what's going to work in it, and coming from a shooting perspective, it's something that I know personally is always exciting when you end up with something new. Is that now you've got to find out what works the best, whether you start at something that approximates the historical, or that you start with something in terms of load and bullet spec and that kind of thing, and work from one end of a scale to the other to find it. I've done both methods. You mentioned that you tried a couple of different patches and weights of patches or thicknesses. Have you always used the 600 ball?
I have. I did try very briefly 0.595 ball, compensating with the patch, and it didn't work at all. It's still hitting okay, but the group just was double the size. So I didn't pursue that because I knew that the 600 worked, so I'll stick with that. It was just a curiosity thing. There was that mold was on sale somewhere, end of the line. So I thought I'd give it a try, but that didn't last. But when I got it originally, I was aiming to use it in competition. So for target load. So I was going more. I was experimenting more with the charge than the patch ball. So once once that was established and I could load it relatively easily, I kept that constant.
Right.
And I got down to as low as 45 grains of Swiss 3. So, no, Swiss 2, so 3F, which gave very, very little recoil. And at 50 meters, it was perfectly fine. It shot well. At the time, I had a lot of misfires, but it turns out after a long time, like 10 years or so, that it was the tightening of the flint. It was just not enough, because originally there was just the screw slot on the top, and you can only put a finite amount of force that way. So then when I had the capacity to drill through, as it was historically, I could then put a torque bar, and the day and night, really, you tighten it as far as you can with the turn screw, but then you put a torque bar in it and you realize how much further you can actually screw it down, whether you're using leather or lead to clamp the flint.
Right. And what do you use?
I personally use lead. This one is very particular about the angle of the flint, of the height of the flint. So with a patch, with the leather, it'd be rather difficult to set up. Whereas with the lead, you can just shim with an extra bit or fold it over, and then it stays there.
Do you find after time that with the lead, the flint gets loose at all?
I haven't, no. I always make sure it's nice and tight before I start shooting.
Right.
No, the flint will wear out before there's any slippage due to lead moving.
Yeah. I know that lead was used historically, well, in conjunction with leather, but lead is something I've never, attempted to use. I used leather to begin with, and it always worked. So I've never deviated from that for sure. And I've got the same little greasy, rotty piece of leather on it that I've used all along, with the little hole cut in the middle, so I can push the flint right back against the clamping screw, and it seems to work okay. I've used different.
I've got the lead sheet. So the lead sheet I use for casting, for roofing lead. Just snip it out with tin snips, again with a hole at the back for the screw, and that works fine.
Good. What was the highest load that you used?
I think the highest load is what we currently use, because when I transitioned from target shooting, the highest I ever got was third place in the Dutch national championships for rifle.
With a 1-in-120 twist Baker rifle.
Yep, shooting against little squirrel rifles with no recoil. I managed to go up to third. So,
well, congratulations.
That was a long time ago. But now, as with pretty much all my firearms, I just go for the service load. So, right. 95. Yeah. I mean, with these, frankly, these muzzle loaders, it's always a case of they use as much powder as they actually need, and the rest gets blown out. So if you put 120 grains in there, half it's wasted.
Right. I think I went as high as 100 in my experiments, and as low as about, maybe not quite like your 45, but I think I probably went down to sort of 60, maybe 55, as I recall, and just sort of systematically worked up in sort of 5 grain increments and established a sort of a workup curve as far as what the results were, and ended up that with the patch and ball combination I was using, which I use a bit of a smaller ball because the barrel dimensions aren't quite 6.25, and that if I use this patch with a 600 ball, it's like mallet time, or at least excessive use of the short starter, and then a real effort with the ramrod. Thankfully, it's a big, heavy, steel bar essentially, but with the combination that I've ended up using, which allows me to load without a short starter with ease, and it's tight enough that the patch doesn't blow by and burn out, that with that combination, I found that the use of the service charge, which is what, 3.5 grams, so it's 96 grains by the book, so 95, let's call it, was the best. And that when I plotted my results, the smallest groups, the best figure of merits, as it were with 96 or 95 grains. So they were onto something, I guess.
We're it's always wrong to assume we know better,
Yeah.
especially these vintage guns. Yeah.
You mentioned that you've used your Baker in competitions and that kind of thing. Is there any other sort of opportunities to use it in other kind of aspects? You mentioned that in the Netherlands at the time you were limited to sort of 50 meters, and obviously you're not living in the Netherlands anymore. So it's sort of, when we come to working on this project, sort of what's the extent of your shooting sort of, I don't know, what's the word, construct, I guess, that you've attempted with your Baker?
Here, it's pretty much been limited to 50 meters. That's just the standard black powder range, or up to, I should say, 25 I could do, but I don't bother. There was one range in Netherlands where I could shoot at 100. I think I only tried it once with the Baker, but I can't remember how I did hit the target, but it wasn't an extended time of experimentation. It was just, there's a slot free on the range, let's give it a go.
Right.
And yeah, here is 50 maximum. Hopefully in the course of next year, may have then more regular access to a 100-meter range where you can use anything you like. And yeah, it would be nice to be able to see how it performs at 100.
One of the things that I've been able to achieve anyway is sort of historically the range of 300 yards is sort of what is mentioned as the extent of any kind of formal training anyway, and even then it's more along the lines of that shooting is left, as far as the references go, to more advanced or capable shooters. But 200 is the sort of the formal extent of shooting as far as any kind of qualifications go. But with the mention then further on as being 300 being sort of able to be attempted by those who have sort of proven themselves already, kind of thing. One thing that I've noticed in those experiments is and I might expect that I can accept my rifle as being, discharging that ball in a roughly the same velocity and the same rate of twist, given the differences in the rifling that we've talked about already, that the accuracy of the Baker is put decisively in context with what was eminently achievable in the era. And it really, I guess when people say that things are accurate or the Baker is accurate, there's a bit of like a generation gap, for lack of a better term, that to the modern ear and eye, accurate means something, but back then accurate meant something completely different in terms of the standard that would be accepted. And in doing so, it's very hard. You have to ensure that you're making that formal stop in your thought process and putting things in the right context. A video that I'm going to be making at some point in the future is specifically related to our friend Plunkett, and some of the outrageous claims, which are much like the Mad Minute claims in relation to the SMLE that Mike and I have talked about, have just exploded past all sense of reality. But I would suggest primarily because of this lack of ensuring that the right context is put, and without that lack of understanding of what the rifle is really capable of. And being able to sort of get to a point where I'm comfortable in being able to say this is a reasonable expectation of the accuracy of a Baker. It's something that, when someone says, it's accurate to extreme range, well, what's that in today's sort of context? Well, is 600, shooting somebody, as the story goes, he shot the French general in the head. at this extreme range or long range or whatever term you want to put to it. And today that, figure 600 or 800 or even 1,000 might be something that would be completely remarkable. Like, wow, that's incredible. But at the time, those kinds of ranges are completely unheard of. Like, that's what the artillery's for.
Even then.
Exactly. But then if you examine some of the details and the anecdotal evidence about the positions and where they were at the time, that you can understand that these extended ranges, even for today, are something that was not the case, and that this kind of accuracy was not a capability of the rifle at the time. So the ranges that were considered to be long or remarkable were today would be something that could be completely unremarkable.
Exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, it's a fun little piece of information that I've got ferreted away that eventually I'll be able to put the video together and have that kind of specific. Maybe I'll even get a full-size target of a general on a horse. I don't know, but something along those lines is an interesting project. But it's, as far as shooting to date goes, it's something that sort of I've fortunately been able to explore.
I am always immensely jealous that you have this forest available where you can shoot it. Okay, obviously we're not talking about 1,000 yards, but certainly 100. I don't know how far you can go in your forest.
Yeah, well, it depends on where I am, but I've shot out to 700. Right. I found a spot that was safe and with no access by road into the area in which I'm shooting. So that's on the extreme side, but typically I'm sort of not limited is maybe the wrong word, but I have areas that I can get to that are sort of certainly to 200 anyway, and lower and down from there. So, yeah. So I guess, sorry.
No, so guys, coming back to that point you were making about the accuracy within historical context, I see sort of main difference the Baker being able to pretty much pick your target up to 100, up to 200. I don't know how the figures stack up, the historical figures. You probably quote me that, but at least up to 100, you can be fairly confident to pick a target and be reasonably confident to hit. Whereas with the line infantry weapons, just forget it.
Right.
Which is significant at the time.
Absolutely. Now, in my experience, and in sort of the historical, the anecdotal kind of piece, 200 is probably where you're still able to achieve a degree of certainty that my rifle shoots at 100. It usually shoots, which we'll get into our results. Well, we've already talked about our results in the video, but perhaps a discussion of those and maybe a bit of a target show and tell. Typically, I can shoot around 8 inches at 100, which I've repeated and again and again and again. So I'm sort of comfortable with. So that's what the rifle is capable of, given that twist and that size of round ball, etc. That does it double sort of to 1620 when you get to 200. It's around there, but if you sort of imagine, the person on the other side, you're still able with care and attention and steadiness. It's not something that you're going to run 200 yards and then stand and shoot them at that range with any degree of certainty, but with rested or at least prone on the ground with your elbows steady, you're pretty much able to, with certainty, hit what's the proverbial man-sized target, I guess. In the experiments that I've done, I've used a full-size version of the target that we shot in terms of the figure anyway, and at 200 it was there, and that was from the kneeling position. So 300, in my experiments at 300, things start opening up a bit, and I think that's also inherent with the nature of a round ball as well.
Yeah, exactly. And the round ball stuff
is that it loses its efficiency, of course, but just it doesn't hold that same degree of accuracy like a conical bullet perhaps would. And you can't accurately extrapolate from 100 to 300. You know, if it was 8 inches, does that mean it's only 24 at 300? In my experience, it's bigger than 24.
Yep.
Yet I'm still shooting the same kind of, you know, with the same method and the same care and whatnot. Maybe that's just down to me. and certainly by the comparison of the results that we had in our project here, I'm very capable of having off days. So
likewise, I'm capable of having good days. So
yeah, sure. I guess that's a perfect way to maybe segue into a quick little discussion about the practices that we arrived at for this project, which of course were the 10 round grouping and the 3 round rapid. For me, it was pretty, you know, conventional. Took my time, used like you did, loose patch and ball. Although I understand you were using what kind of patches or lubricant were you using?
It was they're pre-made. I've had them for years. Oxyoke. The patch diameter thickness is what I use, 0.25, so 0.025. So that didn't change. They're just pre-lubed. That's all. Everyone has their own recipe, or using spit, water, oil, whatever grease. I don't know what you use.
I use just straight vegetable shortening, which in North America, if you say Crisco, that'll be what everyone understands. But there's all kinds of different, obviously, brands of vegetable shortening. But that's what I use. I just melt it down and soak the patches in it. Yeah. You say you've had them for a long time and they haven't sort of diminished in their lubricant quality?
I store them in a little Ziploc package, but I have literally, they're just in my range box. That's the other clutter, and they've never dried up.
Right. That's certainly one aspect of using shortening that does not meet the same standard. If you let them sit, they get excessively gummy. See, you'll be able to keep that for some time, but if I were to make those and have them lubricated, the shortening sort of dries out, becomes very tacky and sticky.
Yeah, this is using I think it's goose shortening with a bit of beeswax.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, it's solid. But if you put a little bit of body heat is enough just to make it tacky.
One thing I noticed in looking at the footage that you sent along, and I experienced the same thing to a degree, is some, not degradation, but some fluctuation in, I don't know if lock time is the way to describe it, because the lock's probably moving at the same rate, but the sort of the rate of ignition is. Sometimes you get that real quick flash to bang, and the other times and it's never what, colloquially is understood about flintlocks, which is this like a fuse effect. It's never like that, but sometimes there is a bit of delay, especially if fouling takes place. Did you notice that while you were shooting?
Absolutely, yeah. And I was going to comment the same thing when I watched your footage, that there's always a constant change of ignition time, let's say. That could be down. Then there's all sorts of theories about powder distribution within the pan. Plus, you have the privilege of being able to prime before loading. So whatever you've poured in is going to be thrown about because you're manipulating the rifle to load it. Whereas I could theoretically, depending on the tradition, put it just under or opposite the touch hole, or there's all sorts of theories. Personally, I just layer it down in the bottom, sort of a constant layer, flat layer. But despite that despite being constant in my application, as you can see, you get an instant ignition, or you get a whoosh and then bang, and that's part of the challenge of flintlock shooting. It teaches you to be absolutely still from the moment you pull the trigger and the follow through then, because you, it will go off at some point, but you never know when or if.
Although you say that with a degree of attention to the process, they are very reliable. As long as your flint is maintained, and when start to notice that maybe a misfire comes into play, that you would put some attention to it, or if you're just constantly watching it and napping it regularly, then and things are not wet, that kind of thing. That I mean, I've shot dozens of rounds in a row without any issue. You're all the while wearing the flint down to a nub, but that's the nature of using a piece of rock to achieve some sort of ignition. It wears down. That there are always these little deviations. Now, what kind of powder were you using to prime?
I use Swiss 4F number 1.
Right.
So
Okay.
it's not dust. It's relatively fine,
Right.
but that's just due to the fact I have to prime separate.
Right.
Otherwise, I haven't noticed if I do a musket cartridge, for example. I had the self priming Swedish musket for a while, and there I think it was just it was 2F, which trickles through due to the shape of the touch hole. But same as the main charge, it works fine.
Right. That I used to use, or I should say used to use, but in certain aspects, used a separate priming flask, much like yours, the kind that you just push on and it kind of distributes like 2 grains worth of whatever. And with success, I probably, in terms of the consistency, it might be just a touch more consistent. But as far as the experiments that we use here, especially using a cartridge, which I'm priming with in the historical way, you have to use the powder that is used for the main charge, and generally speaking, that's something that is reliable. As I say, maybe it's perhaps just slightly more consistent using that finer kind of like 4F style powder, but it's not something I go out of my way to do anymore, especially if I'm shooting in kind of a field kind of military context, which of course open to a bit of anecdotal and either evidence and or debate as to whether that kind of thing actually happened. Chances are it didn't really, maybe with some certain specific people that went that far, but far and away most of the shooting was done with cartridges, as far as what we can ascertain from DeWitt Bailey's book anyway. Which would have meant that sort of separate priming flasks and things that were taken a little bit for granted today, especially in a sport shooting context, just didn't happen in a military one, especially then, right? So
That's true. But some logistical problems and all sorts.
Sure, of course. The you didn't have to change your flint or anything like that during the
no, I managed to keep it the last 3 shots. It just stopped sparking altogether, just nothing. So there I did a quick napping session because I wanted to hold off. I changed then for the cartridges because that was supposed to be sort of rapid, one after another. So I wanted to make sure there's going to be no screw ups. So I hang in there for the precision series, but it didn't matter if I had to try to nap it and try again, nap it, try again until it functioned again.
Right. One thing I did notice is in your loading technique, you used a touch hole sort of plug, for lack of a better term. And what was that? And what might you explain to the viewers what that's all about?
That's I use it out of habit, I guess. I didn't use it for the. I can't remember if I used it for the cartridge. I think I did. But it prevents the load from trickling through. Because in this case it's not supposed to be self-priming, because the touch hole is surprisingly long. Let's say it's longer than we imagine because the barrel is thick, and you do get a fuse effect from ignition because it's got to burn through this powder that's in the hole, and it's quite dense as well because you've rammed it down, so it doesn't sort of trickle out once you manipulate the rifle ready to fire. So I find that if I don't do that, I do get the click, whoosh, bang. Whereas this little, traditionally there would be like a pin. This is actually a little bit of cable where I've put a little brass collar on it, so it doesn't go all the way in. So it doesn't, it's just 3 or 4 millimeter max. So it can't go any further, and then I clamp it down with the frizzer. And it's habit, and especially for target stuff, I find it does make ignition faster despite the natural variation that we get.
Right. You mentioned it earlier briefly as far as the theories of positioning of powder in the pan, essentially, and that's, I think, speaks to that whole aspect of flintlock shooting, is that a lot of people who are perhaps not familiar with flintlock shooting is that expect that fuse effect is powder that is actually burning like Wile E. Coyote stretching along the road, and it eventually gets to the main charge and goes off, when in fact it's one, it's not intended to be that way, and two, it's actually worse if you do it if it ends up being that way, that it's all about the heat and the flash created by the powder as opposed to the actual powder burning and communicating that heat and flash. Very interesting. There was a study a long time ago, and it was using like photocells to measure the time between ignition and the pulling of the trigger, essentially, and the ignition of the charge, using different variations of placement of powder in the pan. And was it level? Was it banked away from it, or was it banked up to it, or covering? I think there was about 3 or 4 variations. And covering. As far as that, I mean, we are talking about like milliseconds here, but they figured that the most, and I wish I could remember off the top of my head the study. I can probably dig it up somewhere in the dark recesses of the interweb, but well, not that dark.
What I do, I push down on I start towards the touch hole, push down, and then just trail it back towards the outside of the lock. So I effectively do that. That's what it ends up. It's just a layer underneath. What I did find, because at the beginning, when I was using these pins, and that was right at the beginning, was I would put it in all the way, so it would hit the other side of the barrel, inside of the barrel, basically, and load. And it wasn't working at all. And I think it's just basically because then you're packing the powder, and when you pull the pin out, you effectively made a hole all the way through, because of this powder is tessellating together. It doesn't collapse the hole that you've created, and there was not enough heat generated. I think there was so much heat loss that it wasn't hot enough to ignite. So I'd work my way back so I wouldn't have this hole, and now it works fine.
The little contraptions you devise based on your experience, eh?
Yeah, it was. Well, I like to tinker. So.
Well, I too, especially when it comes to identifying a fault, and then finding a way around it, for sure. Yep. That's all the whole fun of this kind of stuff, especially when you get into the older stuff like this.
Yeah, I guess one of the other functions, one of the other problems with it, things you have to think about is how fast the frizzen opens. Whether you have effectively a gas chamber at the point of ignition, which will then concentrate the heat towards the touch hole, or whether it's already opened by then, in which you lose a lot skywards.
Right. Have you been able to do any slow motion captures with yours?
I don't have the means to to do that.
I've just recently, just on my phone, so I don't know, it records at like 240 frames per second. So it's not like a commercial grade slow motion camera, but it certainly brings things slow enough to especially in terms of flintlocks, to show the mechanics of it and when things start to happen. And in the 2 or 3 shots that I made with the slow motion feature, it's certainly open all the way before that flash is really developing.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I think one of the three that I filmed anyway, it was sort of like all the way open,
Rebound.
and you can see the sparks, and then the powder flashes.
Yeah.
So it maybe on a really like a sporting kind of lock, that might be a lot different because the geometry might be different, but also things moving a lot faster because the parts are smaller.
Yeah.
An interesting point I saw on the slow motion was, I guess, twofold. One was it was showing me that I was doing things right because I didn't detect a flinch at all from myself. But what you could see very subtly was the rifle moving as the lock is falling. So as the hammer or the cock came forward and the flint struck the frizzen, then you could see just very subtly the rifle shift as that metal literally clunked forward.
Yeah.
And I had never seen that before. But having something in slow motion, even to that sort of basic degree, showed that. And it was something that I was like, okay, I see how that, I mean, there's so many variables when we're talking about flintlock shooting and minimizing them all.
Yeah, that's something I've not been seen but conscious of, particularly in the percussion locks, because they, from my experience, tend to have far heavier mainsprings, and the hammer is striking a fixed part of the barrel, whereas the flintlock, there's some give because the frizzen is also taking part of that energy away, whereas the percussion ones, they're just slamming down on one fixed point, which is, I think, more prone to you unintentionally tilting slightly. But you've seen it in in slow mo.
Yeah, my rule is that if I have seen the flash, then I know that that's what I want to do. If I for some reason don't see the flash because my eye closed, I know that I haven't done something right.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess as far as the 10 round grouping practice went, it was it looked for both of us fairly sort of conventional. We had each had our own loading practices and just adopting the prone position and firing away. Did you notice any heat buildup or anything sort of out of that nature?
No, from my point, there was no heat haze or anything. The sights were clear.
Yeah, nor mine.
I took, the only pause I took, as you saw, is I use a little loading pallet, for a better word, with my powder tubes and ball. So the only break in the sequence was really to put down the next 5. So there's no really period of cooling off.
Right.
But the barrel's massive. It takes ages to really get hot.
I noticed the same in the sense that things are sort of measured and slow enough that there's not a really opportunity for a lot of heat to build up as well. So I guess that brings us to a discussion, perhaps, or analysis, or whatever you want to say, about our rapid practice. Because for that, although the time constraint we put on ourselves to try and do it as fast as possible, hence rapid, but perhaps the most salient feature of this practice was the use of the Macerone cartridge, which I know that you've had an example of right there. There it is. It's got to be one of the sort of the most, how do you put it? Like it's not ungainly, but it doesn't look like a military rifle cartridge, does it?
It is novel, yes, certainly.
Yeah. And what was your experience in making them?
Making them, I didn't find it particularly difficult. Gluing the patch onto the top was fine. I followed strictly the method you'd shown, so I weighted it down with a ball. I just used normal wood glue. Perhaps I was slightly generous with the material around the ball. Then again, there's not that much on the top because you need space on the top to put the thread through. There's not that much excess. So I was curious as how it was going to load, particularly due to the sides, because you've got in fact sort of a double material around the edges, but it loaded far better than I expected.
And was that patch material stuff material that you found separate, or is it the use of the same patch that you?
Unfortunately, I only have the pre-cut circles for
Okay.
for the brown ball, so it's not big enough to make a square for this. So I just hunted around through my rags until I found roughly the same thickness. I think this is ever so slightly undersized, but I thought that because I'm using the shortening, sort of a thicker lubricant, well, that would make it inconsequential.
Right.
So I feel that was fine, and the powder, and then folding it is actually, I think it's quite a good fold. It holds really nicely,
Mm-hmm.
rather than doing the usual, well, the later rifled musket type bending in and folding.
Right.
It's quite an efficient way of closing it up.
Right.
Like
My
you,
thoughts when I made them was that the success that I've had with them is based on a sort of, I make them and then I go use them.
Yeah.
But the thing that struck me about them is the sort of in the military context. And of course, the Macaron cartridge, according to DeWitt Bailey, is something that comes around after the Napoleonic Wars. And there's not really it's just a recommendation of the man, Macaron, who says, here's a way to make cartridges and this will be a good way. But there's no body of evidence to suggest that that was the way they were done, even in a given rifle battalion. It was just his method of doing it. But to date, it's the only associated method of making a patched ball cartridge that has been documented.
Yeah.
And I know I've done a series trying to explore that whole avenue, of which the Macaron has been part of it. But what struck me about that, just when you hold it up and look at it, is that now put that in a pouch for months.
Run around, yeah.
And run around, not only the wear and tear on it, but then also this exposed lubricant. And what in a hot, dusty environment, say like Spain or anywhere else for that matter, the grit and the dirt that will eventually, stick to the lubricated patch, and then having to put that down the barrel is something that I'm not quite sure of the sort of practicality in a military context that cartridge would have.
And do you think they would have contemplated any form of loose packaging?
For the cartridges, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I guess there easily could have been, I guess. That
they're awkward to package, but I could maybe sort of loose wrap.
Yeah, something like that, to keep them protected until you need them. Obviously, that's a method that's used. That they're typically packaged in what, tens.
Yeah.
And in cartridges in general, but specifically for the protection of the exposed patch. There's the question of what would have been used historically as far as what type of fat. Was it sort of mutton, tallow, and what kind of migration happened into the wrap? Did it look like a fish and chip wrapper at the end? Everything's clear and translucent because all the grease is migrated into the wrapper. All these kinds of questions came up in my mind as I'm looking and making these things for the first time. But it's undeniable, as far as in my experience, the use of them, that they just load, especially in a military context where you're ripping them and priming and then loading like you would with any other musket. But as long as you've selected the right size mandrel to roll the paper on, then it just slides, sort of nests in the muzzle with that sort of flower petal arrangement of patching around it, and it just sits there. And then it'll actually crumple and create a bit of a wad, which will further protect the patch. Not that the patch, especially one that thick, needs a lot of protection. Very quick and easy to load. So I can see there's a benefit in one sense that certainly exists with the Macaron cartridge.
I saw, I think I mentioned it in the vid, that I had one issue with loading them. As you say, they slot in nicely, but you have on the top, you have this amalgamation of quite a lot of patch material and then lubricant, which in our cases, we've made them off a while ago, so it's reasonably hard. But it gets slimy, and it was then difficult to put the tip. I mean, the ours are different patterns, so yours is slightly bigger, so they may be why you didn't have so much trouble. But it's very easy for it to slide off, and then you've got a round spherical surface as soon as you slip off, so shoot off left and right. I mean, with practice, I'm sure it's okay. Or you put your hand around the muzzle and use that to guide it on.
Right.
Possible, but that was the only, I say, disadvantage I had. Again, maybe if you minimize, maybe you could snip off the very tip, so you get a flatter surface, perhaps. But I mean, compared to loose powder and ball, it's certainly far quicker, and I think accuracy-wise, it's still more than respectable.
I just used just the sort of the finest sort of non-synthetic thread I could find, and there's no doubt that it just that the bullet and the mass of the bullet as it exits the muzzle doesn't pay that any consequence whatsoever. It just blows right through the thread. And you know, as opposed to something, if you were using string or tying the patch with heavier thread or something, that there might be a possibility of it, you know, hanging about the ball as it exits and then affecting the accuracy. In the examples that I've been able to find after the fact, which actually surprisingly have the paper still attached. They sort of look like a mush, like a toadstool. And this cylinder of paper, you know, it's damaged a little bit, but generally speaking, the ones I found are almost intact, except for the fact they've all been crumpled up below the patch on top of the powder, of course. Very surprising to find them that way. And even with little bits of thread still, you know, sewn into the patch, where it's obviously that the thread's broken and the patch is expanded like a sabot at the muzzle and allowed the bullet to carry on in the usual fashion. So I haven't detected a lot of degradation between loose patch and ball, where the patch is completely uninhibited, and the Master Own cartridge, where it's got that little bit of security with the thread. So
yeah, unfortunately, people were still shooting when I'd finished, so I couldn't go forward and recover. So maybe there will be at some point some very confused range officer walking down range going, what is that? It's that man again with his smoky things.
I guess well, we both we sort of came up with the standard target, which was our friend the baker figure target, and as mentioned earlier in the video, that this comes directly out of Ezekiel Baker's book, and was the version that he used for some of his experiments. So we've scaled it down to well, the grid per se is a 6x6 grid that historically was 6 feet high by 6 feet wide. Ours measures just over 15 inches as my example, the way I printed my note. And but as we can see, you know, and we compared them, you shot appreciably better than I this particular day. That we both had a slight deviation off to one side, but certainly your figure of merit ended up being, you know, much better than mine. And especially your little 5-round grouping there at his just above his waist at his hip there certainly pulls that figure of merit in considerably, whereas my group was you know, more spread out with a resulting, you know, higher figure of merit. So
where was your point of aim?
Point of aim was the blue.
I was just slightly under the blue. So. It was an easy reference at that distance to keep consistent. Yeah.
Sure. I guess, you know, I mean, and you came in third in a national competition with it, so it stands to reason that you know, you've got shooting it well in hand for sure. What would you?
20 years of ownership, I should hope I can get well. Yeah. Yeah.
What would you consider your sort of most favorite aspect of sort of owning and shooting a Baker?
I think the aspect is that it's so comfortable to shoot, regardless of the position. So it's the right. It balances for more or less where the front sight is, rear sight, just slightly in front. So in the normal position, you've got your hand here anyway. You can hold the position quite easily. Whether you're standing, kneeling, prone. I haven't shot prone a lot. The most I've shot it is this year for the Cabin Fever Challenge and this. But I was surprised because there's a lot of rifles that are fine kneeling and standing, but ergonomically are not really set up for prone, or they give you a harsher recoil. But this is comfortable in all positions, and I don't know, there's just something about it. Because it shoots well, you take it out, you're going to have a good, enjoyable shooting session with it. It's not that it's there may be some reliability issues in terms of ignition, but when the shot goes off, you're going to most likely shoot well.
I find it interesting that we've come to a similar conclusion about the rifle in terms of its sort of that comfort aspect, or the pointability, or whatever word you want to use to describe there. Just that when you pick it up and use it, it feels very comfortable and very natural. I would, on my end, I would perhaps add the caveat that I actually put it together, and that's sort of a novelty aspect to sort of the aspect of ownership. And as far as the use of it goes, though, much like yourself, it's just that you're going to have a fun experience. Muzzleloading gods notwithstanding.
Yes.
But the experience of having it and actually holding it in the shoulder and shooting it is never a disappointment.
Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting. We've come to the very similar sort of realizations in that sense.
Everyone should have one.
Sorry?
Everyone should have one.
Yes, they should.
You need a Baker rifle.
What would, if you, I guess, had an opportunity, you mentioned that perhaps sometime in the future of extending your range out to 100 somewhere, would there be any other sort of things that you would want to accomplish?
I think it would be interesting to do something like what you've been able to do is in terms of sort of moving and shooting. So introducing a sort of a practical aspect of maybe start at 100, take an initial shot, then go to a second position, just to get the feeling more in the terms of a historical feeling of what it was like to move, load hastily, take another shot, and so on. So obviously it's nothing compared to IPSC and so on, but just to add the extra context in the historical way. And apart from that, just being able to extend the range would be nice. Rather than
I have a solution for you.
Come to you.
Come to Canada.
Yes, that would be lovely. And you have any?
I guess, as I mentioned, I really want to explore the whole Plunkett thing in a bit more detail, clarity. Richard Moore wrote a fantastic article that I've referenced a couple of times on the channel about what happened with Plunkett and his famous shot at Casabellas. And I've had the fortune to visit there and have some actual drone footage flown over the village, flown over the bridge, positioning, looking back to the positions that the British were in relation to the bridge, and I'm looking forward to putting that together with a bit of shooting. Again, how my target is going to end up looking like, I don't quite know. It'd be fantastic to have a full-size target, but considering that I make the targets using the printer on the computer in chunks, that's a lot of individual pieces and a big jigsaw puzzle to put together to make a horse and a guy on top of it. I don't know how that's going to work, but it deserves
trying at least.
The trying, but also the full size aspect. I don't want to do this sort of scaled. You know what I mean? That I'd like to push it out, because did he shoot, given the ground and the details that are examined in Moore's article, these extended ridiculous ranges that are often quoted today, and having been there, are we looking at sort of more realistically like 200, something along those lines? The language that was used to describe it, was remarkable, quote unquote. So finding what remarkable would mean in the era, in the right context, and then applying the practical aspect of my experience shooting the Baker, and putting everything together in that kind of package. So as far as moving forward, I would say that would be the next major Baker project for me. I don't know when I'll be able to get to it, but I would say for sure that's sort of what I'm focused on moving forward.
Excellent. Look forward to seeing that.
Good. Well, we've been chatting now for quite some time. Lots of interesting information, and as you mentioned earlier, we sort of discussed this. It might have even been pre-COVID. So, the fact that we're able to finally get to this and put this whole thing together has been fantastic. I've really appreciated you coming on, Fab, and also undertaking the practices and making the cartridges and spending the time with us and making the comment about them. That it's fine and dandy for one person to do it, but when we have the opportunity to do it together and sort of compare results, I think that makes things, well, it's more interesting for me. I would hope it's more interesting for the viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope they haven't fallen asleep by now.
Again, thanks so much for coming on. And at some point in the future, either you need to come to Canada or we need to pick another project to work on together, because I enjoy it immensely.
Yes, we'll do that.
Good. Excellent. Thanks so much.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed our little chat about the finer points of Baker rifle ownership. For further viewing, there's lots of Baker content here on the channel. And of course, don't forget to go and say hello to the bloke and the chap over at Bloke on the Range. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.